I'd like to welcome you to the Sankofa Collaborative's panel presentation commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. We really appreciate your joining us today. We know everyone's coming off of a long holiday weekend. If you're not on our mailing list, please join. You can do that by texting Join Sankofa to 22828. If you are already on our mailing list, please feel free to share those weekly resource emails with anyone you think might be interested in keeping up with what the Sankofa group is doing. Basic housekeeping, we ask that you keep your microphone set to mute. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the program, and you can post your questions in the chat space on your Zoom screen. Know also that the program is being recorded. We will post it on our website, and we will be circulating it through our emails as well. So again, feel free to share it with anyone you think might have an interest. So we appreciate your being here. I also would like to give a shout out and a thank you to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, who sponsored this program today. They've been very supportive of the collaborative's work. And now please allow me to introduce our moderator and my very good friend, Linda Caldwell Epps, PhD. Dr. Epps is president and CEO of 1804 Consultants and a founding member of the Sankofa Collaborative. She has more than 45 years of experience in education and working with cultural institutions, including the New Jersey Historical Society, where she was president and CEO, New Jersey Network, Television and Radio. And she was also at Bloomfield College, where I met her for 27 years, where her last role there was vice president for institutional advancement, I believe. Through her company, 1804 Consultants, which she founded in 2011, Dr. Epps works with history and cultural institutions throughout New Jersey and the country. These have included the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the William Trent House, the Newark Public Library, the Scotch Plains Public Library, Old First Church of Elizabeth, and the Timbuktu Historical Site. I'm having trouble tripping over my words today, folks. I apologize. Dr. Epps holds a bachelor's degree from Rutgers University's Douglas College, a master's in American Studies from Seton Hall University, and a doctorate from Drew University. She's also recently the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Princeton University. We'll have to add that in writing, Linda. So I want to thank you again for joining us. And Linda, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. My friend of about 30 years at this point. So good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for joining us today as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. For those of you who are ardent followers of the Sankofa Collaborative, you will notice my introductory remarks today will be much shorter than usual. Two very important reasons for that. One, we are all in for a treat. We have three extraordinary panelists with us today to give them as much time as possible. They have lots to share with you, and I'm sure you will have lots of questions for them. And number two, the media has been overrun with programs and reports on Tulsa. I'm not sure if I can remember any 100-year-old event about African Americans receiving anywhere near this much attention. I'm not exactly sure why. Is it another result of George Floyd? Is it the Black Lives Matter movement? Is it the so-called liberal press in a subversive attack against the far right? I cannot begin to say, but I will say that I am pleased. Tulsa, until recently, was sort of swept under the rug. I guess a breeze blew up the dust, and I'm happy so many people, because so many people have told me that they're only just hearing about Tulsa, or they might have heard that something happened there, but they didn't know exactly what. So I'm happy about the coverage, and the Sankofa Collaborative is happy because, as you know, that is part of our mission, to explore the past and come to an understanding of how that past impacts our present and our future. And to quote one of my favorites, Toni Morrison, who said, "I'm interested in the way in which the past affects the present." And I think that if we understand a good deal more about history, we automatically understand a great deal more about contemporary life. Next slide. Next slide, please. I was speaking with another friend over the weekend. He's a contemporary of mine, so you know he has a few years on him. He admitted that until a month ago, he had never heard of the Tulsa Massacre. He was ashamed. I told him there's no reason to be ashamed. His history is part of what resonates with the Black Lives Matter movement. Our stories have, if they have come to the forefront of at all, have been hidden. Perhaps hidden is not the correct word. They have not been told, or not been told in a way that reflects what happened and why. There is media coverage, systemic racism, white privilege, no matter the reason, whatever your feelings. It's hard to ignore and very hard for me to understand why it is difficult to understand the Black Lives Matter movement, that Black lives had not always mattered in the history of the country, other than the period when the price of their bodies mattered when on the auction block. I had an African-American history minor in undergraduate school, but it was not until the past 20 or so years that serious research has resulted in so much detail and reflection. I thank our panelists for their interest and for their willingness to share their wisdom with us. We are living in the time of a new consciousness, when there is an openness to learning about Black lives. And we, for the first time in my 70-year-old memory, are open to hearing about and learning from events in our past, such as the Tulsa Massacre. The next slide, please. The truth is, Tulsa is one of many such events. As you can see from this chart, regrettably, racial violence has been a distinct part of American history since 1660. This chart here shows things that have happened from 1960 until 2000. While that violence has had an impact almost every ethnic group and racial group in the United States, it has had a particularly horrific effect upon African-American life. Here are some of the major incidents of racial violence profiled on blackpast.org. You can look for yourself. They have a full listing from 1660. I just picked up a piece of it. They range from revolts of the enslaved to more recent urban uprisings, such as the Rodney King riot in Los Angeles in 1992. You will see that many of them occurred in New Jersey. Is this the first or the second? I think go back to the first again, Sam. Yeah, you can pick, there's Paterson, Jersey City, Elizabeth, my hometown, Newark, of course. And you can go back to the second slide again, Asbury Park. Actually, they didn't even Camden, capture all of them in Elizabeth. So our own state has not been immune from this. This map, or this listing does not cover violence affecting a single individual, such as lynchings or police shootings. Hopefully, some of you saw the testimony of 107-year-old Miss Vita Fletcher on C-SPAN America History TV this past week. If you didn't, I'm sure they'll rerun it, and hopefully you can catch one of the reruns. Official media reports say 37 were confirmed dead, 25 Blacks and 12 whites. Survivors say the number is more like 100 Blacks and 30 whites. I've also heard other numbers as well were killed during the 18-hour period of the massacre. I can easily believe that there were more. Many of us on this call, when I peruse the names, lived through the Newark Rebellion of 1967. I have a good friend who was a physician who was sort of quarantined, not by choice, in the emergency room of the hospital. Newark reported officially 27 dead. He claims that he saw well over 150 people lose their lives alone. So I don't know how they go about counting these numbers. Perhaps we'll get some clarity here today. In 2021, in anticipation of events that would take place to mark the anniversary of the massacre, threats were received about reactivation of violence against the community. Why now, 100 years later? Are the issues that led to the Tulsa massacre still plaguing us in 2021? You already know the answer, but let us move along to hear what our distinguished trio of panelists have to say. And I will introduce each one of them now, so hopefully you can remember, so we can just go right through and hear their voices, and you'll have no more interjection from me, hopefully, until the end during our question and answer period. So Sam, if I can have the first, Dr. Roberts, I think. Okay, so my screen share is off. Okay. Okay. So Dr. Alana E Roberts is a historian who studies the intersection of Black and Native American life from the Civil War till modern day. She is author of I've Been There All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land, and has written for the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, Journal of the Civil War Era, Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, Western Historical Quarterly, and Time Magazine. She's currently assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, where she writes, teaches, and gives talks about Black and Native history in the West, family history, slavery in the 5 tribes, Native American enrollment politics, and Black and Native American identity and portrayals in the media. Dr. Roberts holds a doctorate in history from Indiana University and a Bachelor of Arts in History with honors from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we welcome Dr. Roberts with open arms and are very interested in hearing from her today. She will be the first of our panelists, but as I said, I will introduce them all now. So the next slide, Dr. Mihir Desai, who was the first to say yes to our invitation today. We were ecstatic when that yes came, Dr. Desai, you should know that. So we're very interested in all of you, but that you were the first really meant a good deal to us. He hails to us, he's a professor of finance at Harvard Business School and a professor at law at Harvard Law School. He has also taught seminars and classes at NYU Law and Columbia Law. And his areas of expertise include tax policy, international finance, corporate finance. His research has been cited in The Economist, Business Week, New York Times, and other publications. And he has testified to congressional bodies on tax policy issues. He worked at CS First Boston, an investment bank, and McKinsey & Company, a management consulting firm, and is currently research associate in the National Bureau of Economic Research's Public Economics and Corporate Finance programs, and on the advisory board of the International Tax Policy Forum and Center for Business Taxation at Oxford University. Dr. Desai received his doctorate in political economy from Harvard and his MBA from the Harvard Business School, and we welcome you, sir. And our third panelist and speaker is Aria Florant, is co-founder of Liberation Ventures, an initiative to support the Black-led movement of racial repair in the United States. Bravo. Prior to launching Liberation Ventures, she was manager in McKinsey & Company's public and social sector practice, where she helped lead the company's work on racial equity. We are very, very grateful to you for your interest in that kind of work. Before joining McKinsey, she helped launch the first round of training programs at the Obama Foundation, consulted for the San Mateo County Private Defender Program to help incarcerated youth get into college, and develop grassroots nonprofit community development and racial justice programs in East Palo Alto, California. Ms. Ferrant has a Bachelor of Arts in Ethnic Studies from Stanford University, a Master in Business Administration from the Wharton School, and a Master's in Public Administration from the Kennedy School of Government. How blessed are we to have the three of you with us today? We thank you very much for so graciously accepting our invitation. So I'm going to go back, and our first panelist to speak to us will be Dr. Roberts. I would ask you, if you have questions or comments, that you use your chat feature. We will be looking through them, but I think what we're going to try and do is run through the presentations and save our questions for the end of the program. Michelle, as usual, for those of you who have been to our other programs, and there are many of you out there who have, will present the questions to the panelists at the conclusion of their remarks. So, Dr. Roberts, you're up.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Dr. Caldwell Epps, for inviting me here today to commemorate this very important anniversary. As you said, there has been a lot of coverage, and I'm very glad. I mean, I'm really excited to see this interest. I hope this represents a sustained interest in Black history and not just kind of a blip on the radar. So today I'm going to speak pretty briefly about what I see as the deeper history of the Tulsa Massacre. Of course, if you want to know more, you can ask me a question after the talk. And then also I would encourage you to purchase my book, which will tell you more. I've been here all the while. So I was born in a small northern city.
But I'm going to ask Sam to put you on speaker mode, or is it just my machine that has you? Is it just me? Yes, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, it was me. I'm so sorry.
So you can hear me fine?
Okay, now I am, yeah.
Okay. So I am starting with a personal angle because the book I wrote is personal and I have personal history in Oklahoma. So I was born in a Northern California city called Hayward. You perhaps have not heard of it, but it's near Oakland. But my father's family is from Ardmore, Oklahoma, which is in the central southern part of the state of Oklahoma. And so I grew up coming to Oklahoma every few years or so to go to family reunions in Ardmore and Berwyn, Geneaughtree. And I didn't really realize at the time, as most kids, how amazing it was that I was exposed to so much of my family history and so much kind of general Black history. Like I was very much taught about the Tulsa Massacre as well as Black Wall Street. And so it was actually mind-blowing to me when I found out about 2 years ago that so many people didn't know about that. So in addition to kind of that general Black Oklahoma history, I also was taught my family's history, and I was really physically exposed to it. And so we drove to Calvary Baptist Church, which is a church that my family members built over 100 years ago. We went to a cemetery that held the graves of my ancestors born in the 1800s. And so this was very normal to me, kind of seeing the physical manifestations of Black history. And it's only when I began researching my family history as a college student that I realized just how unique and kind of special this was. But I also found out that the church, the cemetery, the land that my family had owned for generations was the result, first of all, of enslavement. But that enslavement was by not white people, but Native Americans. And so we all know that African chattel slavery was introduced to the Americas by Europeans. But how did Native Americans come to start owning Black people as slaves? How did we get to this kind of historical moment? So after the United States' birth as a country, the government used various tactics to interact and deal with Native people. Those included war, and then on the other hand, those included treaties and kind of more formal agreements to share land. In the late 1700s, white American politicians and reformers began encouraging Native Americans, particularly those in the East and Southeast, to adapt aspects of their culture, Euro-American culture, saying that this is more civilized and you should dress like us, you should have the same religion as us, you should kind of form your political structures in the same way we have formed ours, basically arguing that this would better them and their societies, but also this would be helpful to white Americans and white Europeans, because if they were living like white people versus living in the kind of communally owned land that is most of Native American tradition, then they would use less land. And then coincidentally, that land could be used by white Americans and white Europeans. And so as part of this assimilation, as slavery becomes more and more important to the United States, they also encourage Native Americans to begin becoming part of this system, begin owning Black slaves. And so there are 5 Indian southeastern tribes who decide to adapt slavery, as well as some of these other things like clothing and like religion. And they are the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee. And so Cherokee, of course, are probably one of the most well-known tribes. These are also 4 other big, pretty well-known tribes that are in today, Oklahoma. They also had a lot to do with the COVID-19 vaccination success in Oklahoma. So you may have seen these tribes in the news. And so in addition to what I've mentioned, slavery, they also create their own newspapers. They also do change their government to become a tripartite government like the United States. And so all of these 5 tribes have a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And so basically I'm telling you about all of these changes because they represent the fact that these 5 tribes are quite different from most of the other Native nations across North America. They chose to take a different path. And within these nations, of course, there is a diverse kind of idea of what an Indian is and what kind of it means to be a member of these tribes, but generally the leadership, the people who are influential in these nations own slaves and also believe in kind of assimilating to a certain point to American norms. And so these leaders see these changes, such as slavery, as helping them kind of become strategically a part of the United States. And so they're able to make alliances with them. They're able to kind of go treat with them on a better foot than most other Indian nations because white Americans begin seeing them as more similar to themselves. Now, as part of beginning to own slaves, the 5 tribes, of course, also changed their laws to include things like the ability to beat slaves, things like the ability to make it illegal for slaves to read, to write, to gather. All of the things that we think of as legislation that only exists in the US South was also present in these Indian nations. But when we think about how far this assimilation actually gets Native people, it's not very far. And so we get Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, which most of us have probably learned about, because white Americans still end up wanting this land. And so the 5 tribes I've mentioned, the 5 slaveholding tribes, lived on land in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, that was agriculturally rich. And so white Americans were very interested in using this for farming and for expanding slavery. And so this is kind of another one of the intersections of Black and Native American history that I study, because it is really only the removal of Native people from the South and Southeast that allows for the expansion of plantation slavery. So Native Americans fight this legally and militarily. You perhaps have heard about the court cases that the Cherokees launched with the Supreme Court, but they are unsuccessful and they make their way to Indian Territory. So Indian Territory is what Oklahoma was called before it became a state. And so I'm telling you all of this because the first people who went to Oklahoma, the first migrants, were actually Native Americans and then the people who were enslaved in their nations. And so these are the first Black people actually in this region. And so often the story starts with African Americans coming from the US and creating places like Black Wall Street, creating all the other all Black towns. But there is another migration that comes first that really kind of will explain why these people, these Black people, come later on. So on this Trail of Tears, enslaved people are able to help their owners, or forced to help their owners by chopping lumber, by helping them hold possessions, by helping the old and the young make this very long and horrific journey. And so again, the Trail of Tears is another intersection of Black and Native history. For these 5 tribes, Black people were a part of this journey that we think of as so important to Native American history. As they leave their homes, white slave owners move in. Now, once these Black and Native people are in their new home, they rebuild. They build homes, they build plantations, they build government buildings, many of which you can see today. But after about 30 years, so this is the 1830s that we're talking about removal, about 30 years later, of course, as you know, the United States is in discord over the institution of slavery. And so abolitionists have gained a foothold in popular culture. Various states are voting to allow within their borders. And these are slaveholding Indian nations, right? What are they going to do? Are they interested in these conversations? Yes, they are. And so again, Native people, Native American nations are very much a part of physically fighting in the Civil War and also in these conversations about should Black people be citizens? Is slavery right or wrong? And so it's not just a Black-white dichotomy that makes up this really important event, the Civil War. And so the Confederacy begins to court the 5 tribes, knowing that they have similar sentiment. A lot of their leaders own slaves, and so they care about not just maintaining slavery, but also about maintaining kind of a lack of federal intervention. And so they have these 2 points on which they agree. The Confederacy also says that they will pay them the money for their homelands better and quicker than the Union, the federal government has, that they will allow them to keep their land in Indian territory forever. There are all these ways that the Confederacy tries to get to and persuade these 5 slaveholding tribes. And they are partially successful. And so, as I said, the members of these tribes do fight for the Confederacy, but members also fight for the Union. And so they are split, just like the United States is split. But after the Civil War is where this gets a little more interesting. So the United States basically punishes these tribes for fighting for the Confederacy, even though it was only in part. And they say, you have to create new treaties with us because you have kind of went outside of our government. And so in these new treaties, they force these Indian nations to free their slaves, to make their slaves citizens, and also to give their slaves land. And so in my book, I argue that we could perhaps see this as one of the only acts of reparation that happens in the 19th century. And it is the United States forcing Indian nations to do certain things for Black people that the United States itself actually refused to do. And so many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the General, let's see, Sherman, I always get his name wrong, and the kind of effort to get 40 acres to African Americans in the United States that was not permanent, right? And so this is because white Americans are really unable to see taking land from a white person, a white American, even if they are a former Confederate, and giving it to Black Americans wholesale. And so even though during the Civil War, this happens temporarily for Black people in the Carolina lowlands and sealands, this isn't permanent. And so this land is taken back. African Americans never really get anything that would put them on a level playing field coming out of slavery. But in the West, in Indian territory, this does happen. And so there is a transfer from former slaveholders, Native Americans, to their former slaves in the form of land allotments. And so all of these former slaves in each nation, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Seminole, they all get different amounts of land. For people like my family who were owned by Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians, it was exactly 40 acres. And so it was this kind of very interesting, almost parallel world in which I could see this policy making happening, but that didn't happen in the United States for various reasons. Now, I say that this didn't happen in the United States, also politically, because at the time that these treaties are made in 1866, the United States has not given Black men the vote. They have not, of course, given Black women the vote either. But this all happens at once for the former slaves of Native Americans within one treaty. And so they have far different opportunities with this land and with these rights that are granted to them in these treaties. And these opportunities are why life in Indian territory is not perfect for Black people, but is far better in multiple ways. And so not only do they have land with which to start their new lives, but they also are not suffering from large-scale white violence because there aren't that many white people in Indian territory. And so there is certainly discrimination and prejudice on the part of a number of Native people, but you don't have like conservative, large-scale terrorist groups, essentially, in Indian territory, not until you have large-scale white migration happening in the late 1880s and 1890s. And so this seeming absence of violence and the presence of rights and land is why so many Black people from the United States flock to this Western part, this Western place, which is Indian territory, after emancipation. So this Black migration is why Oklahoma Black towns exist. And it's why Black Wall Street existed, because there were already Black people there. And those Black people were slaves of Native Americans. And so I know that many people across the country, only just learned a year or two ago about the massacre, thanks to Watchmen, thanks to Lovecraft Country, thanks to articles detailing what happened after those shows. But a lot of those kind of short rundowns on what happened miss this larger history, this deeper history of the region, which I think is important, because Black Wall Street and the Tulsa Massacre is not really just about that one part of Tulsa. It's about the broader history of Black people and Native people in Indian Territory, in Oklahoma. So African Americans came from the South to Indian Territory and later to Oklahoma, because the United States has forced Indian nations to recognize Black rights and to give them a form of reparations. And so this kind of environment where Black rights were accepted and tolerated, along with oil and natural gas that was found in parts of Tulsa and other parts of Oklahoma, is what allowed Black entrepreneurs to really flourish and to create the Greenwood District or Black Wall Street. And so that's why you have the rooming houses, the grocers, the auto repair shops, the dentist's office, the movie theater, all owned by and catering to Black people. And so many of these Black people who created businesses on Black Wall Street were Black natives themselves, were the former slaves of Native Americans who either had land allotments that were in that area of Tulsa, or used what they had gotten kind of from the resources or farming, et cetera, that they were doing on their land allotments in other parts of Oklahoma to invest and to create in this region. And so Dr. Caldwell Epps has very well summarized what happened in the Tulsa Massacre. And so I don't really feel the need to go into that. That's not the end of the story. There is a longer kind of internment of African Americans after the 31st and after June 1st, where many people are left in essentially pens until a white person will vouch for them and take them out of those pens and say, this Black person is not going to mess up the city further. This Black person is a good Black person. And so it's certainly a longer event than like 2 or 3 days. But it's also not over, because Black Tulsa is rebuilt. And there are people like Buck Colbert Franklin, who was the father of historian John Hope Franklin, who made sure that white Tulsans were not able to push through legislation that wouldn't allow Black Americans to rebuild. And so it's certainly a story that goes on, and a story that shows the resilience of Black people and Black Americans. But in closing, if you do take anything from this talk, please do take away that while the massacre is an important piece of history within itself, of course, I don't feel that we can truly understand it without understanding what came before it. So we can't understand why so many Black people flocked to the state of Oklahoma without understanding that they came because they saw Black people already there. And they saw Black people who had won and received certain rights and land, and they hoped that they would get that too. And for many of them, they were able to capitalize on this specific environment governed by Native American people and Native American tribes. And so they came to Indian Territory with many hopes. They didn't necessarily get a racial paradise, but they did get much opportunity that they were not given in the South. And so understanding this kind of Black Native history that I've talked to you about today is really central to understanding so many parts of our history: Indian removal, Reconstruction, and race relations and racial violence. So I would love to talk more in the Q&A.
Thank you so very, very much. I forgot to add in my introduction of you that I asked my good friend Kristen Brazil-Kulfkin from Rutgers University to recommend someone, and you came first and foremost. Now I know why. I am blown away. Thank you so much. I did not know any of that history, and like my other friend who did not know about Tulsa, feel ashamed that I understand now how little I actually do know about Tulsa. So thank you very much, and we'll hear from you later. Dr. Desai, you are up next. We're a little informal in Sankofa, in case you didn't.
Of course. Thanks so much. Thank you, Dr. Caldwell-Epps. I really appreciate the introduction and being part of this panel. And let me just begin by saying I'm a bit of an interloper. certainly compared to the other two panelists who are really experts in this field, I come a little bit from the outside in the following sense. I'm not a historian. I'm an economist. I think about finance. I think about tax policy. And so I'm very much an interloper. But what I do bring to bear is an effort over the last year to kind of create teaching material around Tulsa. And I can tell you how that happened, and then tell you a little bit about what I've learned in the process of doing that, about the broader debate about reparations. So I thought I would divide my comments into three parts. The first is just to give you a sense of what that experience was and how it came about, because I think part of what you all are interested in is thinking about history and how to make it accessible and how to make it teachable. And I wanted to share a little bit about that. Second, I want to just share some lessons for me personally about what I learned about America, about Tulsa, and about reparations from now teaching this case that I wrote to more than 1,000 people. And then third, I want to talk a little bit about the role of business. I'm a business school professor as well as a law school professor, and I want to think about increasingly in a time when people ask business to do more, what could and should they be doing in this regard? So as I mentioned, I'm just going to put this in the chat, what happened in the last 12 to 14 months is I was enormously frustrated with the events of last summer, and I didn't know what to do with my frustration, and I channeled it into writing a multimedia case study about the Tulsa Massacre. I put the link in the case in the chat if anybody's interested in it. And what did I learn about how to make that kind of material teachable and more accessible? So the first thing that we did that I think made a big difference in writing that case is to find somebody who links the past to the present. And in our case, it was this really remarkable person, Regina Goodwin, who is both a survivor of, both a descendant of a survivor of the Tulsa Massacre, but then also an Oklahoma representative. And I think she becomes a lens for understanding the past and how it maps to the present and how it can map to the future, because she has ambitions for reparations that have been so far afforded. The second key thing that we did in writing the case was we wanted to be true to the history, but that was a matter of really just amazing amounts of synthesis. But I think what we did that was novel and that helps in making it teachable is to link it to the broader reparations debate today. And that is where I think students and participants who read about it really gain the most, which is just a way of saying what I wanted was to make Tulsa indelible in American history, but then also find a way to link it to current debates. And it's particularly interesting because the Tulsa Massacre and the reparations arguments for it are relatively, quote unquote, easy in the context of reparations debates, meaning they're specific, they're property related, they're relatively proximate in time. There was damage caused by the state. So one can have a discussion about reparations in that setting when I teach the case after talking about the massacre, but then one can use that to talk about the broader reparations question. So for me, writing this case, and I would love it if you took a look at it and circulated it to as many people as you can, it is to try to make the history more accessible and to make it refract on our current day question, one of the most vexing of which is, how do we think about reparations, which I think is a really difficult, really, really difficult question. So what did I learn during this process of teaching this and writing this? And let me just say a couple of things. The first is I learned that there's this huge hunger to know about these things and to talk about them amongst young people today. It's just remarkable amounts, and not, I'm talking about aspiring business people, I'm talking about aspiring lawyers. There's just huge, huge hunger. At the same time, I think there's huge trepidation about the way they talk about it. And I confess the conversations can be fraught, and you can feel people kind of holding back as much as you can feel people going forward with their thinking. But just learning how to talk about it, I think, is an enormous part of what we need to do. The second part of what I learned is just to kind of think a little bit more about history. And obviously, Dr. Roberts thinks about this much more deeply than I do. But one lesson for me has been that quickly debates can kind of denigrate into kind of situations where people either embrace a heroic narrative of America or and anti-heroic narrative America. And I think one of the things that the case kind of demonstrates is neither of those is terribly useful. So the ability to talk about both of those narratives, I think, is a really important part of talking about our history. The third thing I think I learned about this is just, for me, there's a great deal of learning about how to teach material, which is really out of my bailiwick, and how I screwed up certain things and how I did certain things right. And I'll give you two quick examples of it. And I say this in part because I think as someone who's not a historian, it's easy to screw up. And the temptation for the people who are outside of these domains is not to write about these things and not to talk about them. But my great lesson out of this last year has been, through that process of screwing up, I've learned just a tremendous amount. So as one example, in the original draft of the case, I had an image of a lynching in the case study. And I did it because I thought it was going to be useful to understand the Tulsa Massacre, because as some of you may know, it was triggered in part by a fear of a lynching. And I got a bunch of volunteers before I really started to teach the case to read the case. And I taught the case. They were all really happy. And then afterwards I said, if anyone wants to stick around, let me know what you think. And they just challenged me about why I would include a photo of a lynching. And at first my reaction was very knee-jerk. And it was, oh, come on, it's really important for XYZ reason. And they kind of pushed back and they said, they said basically it was a gratuitous image of violence against Black bodies. And I still resisted, but I learned over time that they were right, and I took it out because I came to understand it as something that was, I think, gratuitous. So there's just an enormous amount of learning for people outside of these domains, I think, to be had by learning how to talk about these things and learning how to understand what is actually at stake for people. At the same time, I also learned that many parts of this debate are too fraught. I was effectively told that I shouldn't be teaching a case about the Tulsa Massacre because I'm a finance person who, may not really be able to handle a discussion of this depth. So it does strike me that there is a part of this which is a little self-defeating, which is, I think, people erect barriers to kind of who can talk about this. And I think that can be really unfortunate. Finally, I think on reparations, I learned that it is a very, all the arguments about reparations come out so quickly in these discussions, and it's fantastic. So you'll hear all the people who voice why reparations are so important in this specific Tulsa case, and then also why maybe they can be problematic. What is notable to me is how many people can be for Tulsa and then somehow get off the train when we go to a broader question of reparations for Black Americans. And that discussion is always, I think, really fascinating. So to me, there's just, I think, again, the Tulsa case is relatively easy for reparations. And to see people voice all the great arguments and have it work, and then yet kind of think to themselves, when they go to the broader question, they stumble. And so to me, I think we both need to work on how to think about reparations in the Tulsa setting and come to terms with why it's been so hard. In part, what I do in the case study is talk about other examples, including Rosewood in Florida, and of course, the examples of Japanese Americans and in the Holocaust, why and how arguments for reparations can succeed and when and how they often don't. The third set of things I just thought I would talk about briefly is just to talk about the role of business in addressing all this. And I think we just have to come to terms with what is, I think, a remarkable dissatisfaction with political processes today, which has been displaced with rising expectations of what businesses can and should do. And I think that transition of ambition from the state to the private sector is problematic for many, many reasons. But I think it is a reality. And you see it in calls for greater corporate social responsibility. You see it in calls for so-called ESG movements with investors. And so businesses are being asked to do more and more. Think, obviously, of the voting rights issues in Georgia and Texas, and the call for CEOs to speak out more plainly about those questions. What strikes me about that debate in reference to this is so much of what business is doing is relatively superficial and is relatively cheap talk with maybe some dollar signs attached to it. What is lacking, and I think is lacking seriously, is the depth of understanding of the historical background that Dr. Roberts just referenced, and that I think is really important for business leaders to understand. And so too often in business education, we kind of think to ourselves, well, we'll have, we'll teach DEI kinds of issues or diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, but we don't talk about the history in the depth that we just heard it, and in the depth that we really need to talk about it. And the reason is because without understanding that history and without understanding that depth, I think most of what business is doing is a little bit superficial. And I think reparations actually offers an opportunity for business, qua business, as a segment of society and as a important part of communities, to really reconsider their role. You've seen some examples of that with Amalgamated Bank and other private sector companies, but I think really focused efforts to think about reparations by private actors is actually maybe the most interesting thing happening in this space. Obviously, California has recently passed legislation to think about this more seriously, and there have been ongoing efforts at the federal level. But my instinct is that actually businesses that take their obligations seriously will go beyond the rhetoric, do hard work on history, and begin to channel their efforts towards some form of repair, broadly understood, as a better way to do things than maybe they're kind of currently somewhat empty rhetoric. Great, and I look forward to your questions and thoughts.
So I thank you. I have about 3 questions down myself, maybe 4, but we will move on. Thank you very much. And our next speaker, who I don't see on the screen, but I'm assuming that she's still here and I just don't see her.
I am here.
Laura? Okay, good. Thank you. And you need the screen at this point, correct?
I'm gonna add some visuals. Yes. Let's see if I can screen share. Okay, great. I'm gonna pull this up and I'm gonna go to my full screen. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, great. Awesome. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Caldwell Epps and to my 2 co-panelists. This ended up being a really perfect kind of progression because we started very much rooted in the history, moved to Dr. Desai as kind of a connection point between the history and today. And now I'm going to talk about an organization that I co-founded called Liberation Ventures, which is really about kind of what we do from here, where we go from here. I'll share just a little bit about me. My name is Aria Florant. I'm zooming in from Washington, D.C. I have been working in racial justice for the last 15 years in a lot of different domains. I really consider myself sort of a person who's traversed a lot of different worlds, trying to always be building bridges in between, but have done organizing work in movement spaces in California, all the way to working at McKinsey & Company, which is a kind of blue chip private sector consulting firm. And as a result, done a lot of thinking about kind of the roles that these different entities can play in the broader work of Black liberation and racial justice. But then in addition, how they need to partner together to work together. And how that actually is what creates kind of sustainable social change. And so about a year ago, co-founder and I started working on an idea, and long story short, that idea evolved into Liberation Ventures. We are, so our official mission statement is what you see here on the screen. We fuel the Black-led movement for racial repair in the United States. And what that concretely looks like is that we support organizations across the country that are doing work in truth, reconciliation, and reparations. We see our North Star goal as federal comprehensive reparations policy, but we know that there's a lot of work that we need to do in order to get there, in particular to build public support for this issue, as well as to kind of build the movement of grassroots actors that are going to build the power that we need to actually see really durable federal legislation passed. So our entry point is at the grassroots level for that reason. And there's an ecosystem of organizations that have been working on this in some shape or form for decades. Like, we are very much kind of stepping into this in a way that is on the shoulders of giants, honoring the elders that have been working on this for a long time. But it's been a chronically underfunded field. And so our goal is to do 4 things. Number 1, to bring more money into this space by raising and deploying funding. Number 2, to support organizations through technical assistance. Number 3, to build sort of connective tissue across that ecosystem so that it's easier for organizations to collaborate. And number 4, to build out real kind of frames and thinking around what repair actually means. So I'm actually going to dive into that. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So we think about repair as sort of a 4-part continual cycle between reckoning, acknowledgement, accountability, and redress. So this is how we think about what a great reparations program looks like, both in terms of outcomes you see on the right, but then also the fact that we should be actually thinking about repair as both financial and non-financial. At least that's the way that we think about what will actually enable communities to, to better. We want to see the racial wealth gap closed, but then in addition, we want to see our systems actually, transforming so that our systems are not harming Black folks in the way that they have been for hundreds of years. So reckoning really deals with kind of understanding and grappling with harm, acknowledgement being admission that harm has been done, accountability, so really taking ownership and a willingness to take responsibility for harmful actions. And then obviously the actual redress that often is in the form of dollars, but could also mean real transfers of power. And we think this is basically a cycle that continues over and over again, and that our goal is to actually kind of scale a culture of repair in our systems. And I want to also just kind of tie this back to something that Dr. Desai said, which was that, as we grow up in American society, you have to really seek out opportunities to both learn about this kind of history, but then also learn how to have conversations about it. As Dr. Desai said, we aren't taught how to have hard conversation about race unless you do things like join in, major in ethnic studies or do some kind of program that enables you to. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we think about as kind of how we can actually transform our systems for the long term, is that across the country, we need to be building the capacity in people to both diagnose and then transform our systems to be more anti-racist. And we looked at, when we first started out, we looked at models in other countries. And there are so many things both to learn and not to repeat about different countries, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Germany, whether it's Sierra Leone, whether it's Rwanda, Canada. But one of the things that we found really interesting about Germany is that it was a bottom-up student movement, a generation after the Holocaust, that really created the culture of memory that Germany now has. So everyone in Germany grows up learning the truth about the Holocaust, understanding like the extent of the harm that was done by going to museums, by going to monuments, by having rituals. And, it's something that is much, much more deeply embedded in their culture than it is for us in regards to American slavery here today. And so that's one of the places that we look to as a model for how we can actually create a more reparative culture in the US. So I will skip through some of our slides here, but we think about this as sort of a 3-phase process. The first phase being really focused on building a thriving and sustainable ecosystem, as well as normalizing reparations in mainstream dialogue. Second phase being demonstrating success and feasibility through pilots. And there are already pilots happening now. Obviously, probably you've heard about Evanston, Illinois. Obviously, there's a lot of work around Tulsa happening. But we also see there's potential to, for example, do more high profile pilots where we can actually prove the democratic, the economic, and the moral imperatives of this work at the state level, so that then those learnings, those best practices could then inform the federal program. So that last third phase is really focused on work at the national level. So obviously this is, our attempt to think through kind of what might the sequencing look like related to how we actually start to weave all of these local efforts into a broader, bigger narrative story about how we can move towards federal reparations. Obviously, it's not gonna look as clean as this PowerPoint page does, but this is kind of how we think about a way to build momentum toward the federal effort. I can actually just pause there and we can go into questions.
I'm sorry, so you caught me writing a note. Actually, so I will thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just overwhelmed by the three of you. And I thank you. Now, I won't go first if there are questions in the chat. Michelle, are you looking?
There are a couple of questions. If you want, I'll just start at the top.
Oh, okay. And I'll try and remember and hold mine. Go ahead.
Okay. What issues keep people who support the idea of reparations in Tulsa from accepting the idea of broad scale reparations for slavery and historic racism?
You're on mute. Dr. Desai, you're on mute.
So, I can give you my experience in debates on this, which is debates I've tried to foster between students. I think what happens is that people start to lose the specificity and they lose the goal. So in the Tulsa example, there's property damage. It's very specific. There were claims filed that were contemporaneous that were never fully adjudicated. There was a clear actor who was the state, and it's relatively proximate. That all makes it pretty easy. And just to be clear, it has been very hard and they have been heretofore unsuccessful. What happens when you go to a broader debate? And this is where Aria's organization comes in and has thought much more about this than I have. I think what can happen to people is, number one, they lose, they get lost in the details a little. Like, how do we do this? And that is why the international example is so great, right? So in the case, and what Aria referenced, understanding how it happened in Rosewood, or understanding how it happened for Japanese American in the internment camp experience, is really important, because then it becomes clear that if we want to do it, we can do it. The second thing they stumble on is really trying to think through the moral question, which is, well, wait a second, aren't other claims, how far back do you go? How many claims do you try to adjudicate? What is the goal? In Aria's slide, I think she had in part closing the black-white wealth gap. Who should pay? Who should receive? It all becomes more diffuse and much messier. And I think people's initial reactions to that is to kind of draw back and to say, well, maybe not. I get it in Tulsa, but I don't get it over here. And I think that is the challenge. That, first off, again, it hasn't worked yet in Tulsa. So we haven't even passed that test. And now we have to go to this much more ambiguous setting. So are we trying to, A, repair a previous harm? Are we trying to ensure that something doesn't happen in the future? That's a little bit of the Germany story. Are we trying to rectify a current imbalance? In the Tulsa example, that's all quite clear. And in the broader setting, I think it's harder. But I'm sure the other panelists have other views. But I think that's what happens to people as they move from the specific to the general setting.
I agree with that. And I think the only thing that I'll add is we get the question a lot. A lot of people just move to, the how, right? Like, how do we figure this out? Is this really feasible? How do you figure out who gets it and who gets what? And I think where I tend to go when people ask me that question is, it's all really important questions. Those are all things that we need to figure out. The question is like, do we have the will and the motivation to figure them out? Because if we can go to the moon, if we can find a COVID vaccine in 1 year, we can do hard things. We know as a country that we can do hard things. I think that if we, spend the time and the resources and, get folks into that kind of productive, adaptive zone where we're figuring it out, then we can do the right thing.
I would just add one more thing about that, Aria, which is I think part of the interesting debate that happens also is about the debt versus the deficit, right? So I think some people worry that by emphasizing historic debts, we lose sight of current deficits. Not to use an overly economics kind of lens on this, but meaning in some sense that by focusing on the debt, and if we agree to a reparations plan, somehow there's absolution. And then we're not talking enough about today's problems.
Yep.
And so kind of knitting together the understanding that today is rooted in the past, precisely what Dr. Caldwell Epps began with the Toni Morrison quote, and is the foundation of the future, I think is what people somehow kind of miss out on a little.
So I'm going to sort of interrupt here, even though I know that there are other questions there, because what I can't remember which one of you said, we have to learn the history. We have to learn how to have conversations about the history, and then we can build our capacity for resolving some of these issues, right? I'm thinking back to January 6th, which I have been stuck on since January 6th, right? So there's this entire swath of people out there who absolutely even cringe at the notion that perhaps people of color's rights were abused. So how do we get even a small percentage of that population, which would be needed if we're going to use the prescription that some of you have talked about this afternoon?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. So I like to think about this like an adoption curve. So going back to some of the business references.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, you have folks that are already on board. They are the early adopters. You have folks that are likely to come on board if they just thought more about the issue or, read a book about it, et cetera. And then kind of across that curve, you have, people who become less and less likely. And I think that right now, the biggest, most important thing for us to do is to start moving people who are already kind of on board or close to being on board into kind of a coalesced and organized group of people that can then grow and grow and grow. So I think about this very sequence. The communities that I'm trying to reach right now are definitely not the people who were storming the Capitol on January 6th. I will say, though, that we have precedent for public opinion changing a ton on an issue. So we've done a lot of learning about the marriage equality movement. And reparations actually has more public support today than marriage equality had when Freedom to Marry, which was the organization that really drove that work, began. And, some would say that that's a much more simple issue. And I think in some ways, yes, it is. It was obviously able to be adjudicated by the courts in a way that this probably won't be. And it's hard to even, it feels more simple now looking back in this cultural environment, but 30 years ago, I mean, it was extremely, fundamental to some of the more religious Christian tenets of this country. It felt just as deeply hard to figure out, I think, as reparations does today, because it's so embedded in kind of some of the founding ideals of this country. And so I think that we also have to have like a healthy dose of imagination and of hope about the future and about what's possible related to changing public opinion on something. And I do think that that's actually just even a really important strategic question too, because if we had $1 billion and could force an advocacy campaign at the national level right now to pass reparations, I actually don't think that that would be the right answer, because you wouldn't have the public support. And so it would get, first of all, I think that policy wouldn't end up being durable and sustainable. It would get repealed. But in addition, I think when policies pass that folks don't really understand or know why they're important, then that's when actually society doesn't really change. It becomes kind of this de jure and de facto thing. We saw that with segregation and busing. And so to me, moving hearts and minds across, like along the timeline of also building power to change policy is really important.
Okay.
I was just going to say one quick thing on that, which is, I don't have any wisdom to offer about how to appeal to the January 6th crowd, but I do think adoption curves are interesting and they can become very quick without knowing it. And so I confess, in the last 12 months, I think the debate on reparations has shifted. Like, I think it's shifted in the last 12 months, in the last 2 years. And it comes in waves, right? I mean, I'm sure you might remember 3 or 4 decades ago, there was a lively debate about reparations with Randall Robinson and others trying to put things forward. And in fact, at that point, it was the left who kind of suppressed that idea, right? Or kind of suggested it shouldn't be as much of an emphasis. So these ideas have a life. And I think there's reason to believe it is coming to bear. I think the one critical fork in the road for people like Arya and others to think about is, and it's a little bit of the Rosewood-Greenwood distinction, which is, Rosewood was argued and succeeded in reparations based on property damages. And Tulsa, obviously there's various things to do with Oklahoma political economy that are really important, and Florida political economy that are really important. But the framing of reparations as property damage and property and rights damage and infringements on rights is one way to go. The other way to go is broader racial justice. And so, for example, if you're interested in the latter framing, then you are, look at the black-white wealth gap, we have to rectify it, we have to even it out, that's the answer. If you're on the property side, you are, think about lost earnings, think about the mortgage redlining, think about those things and rectify those things, and the descendants of those people get money. Those are really, really different strategies. So I think that's, for people like Aria, I think that's the fork in the road. Which way do you go in that fork?
Yeah, this is so fascinating, Dr. Desai. We could talk about this forever, but I just want to name it that was the exact fork that the marriage equality movement was at as well. They were trying to decide whether to frame this around LGBT rights or around freedom to marry. And they did a ton of research around persuasion and around what people thought. And they learned that rooting this in ideals of freedom around, and this goes back to what you're saying about America, was more persuasive. And so it's fascinating. Yeah.
So I don't want to portray myself as a naysayer, although I am one who was thoroughly convinced that I would never see a man or woman of color holding national office. I never thought there would be a Barack Obama or a Kamala Harris. So I'm I know that miracles can happen. However, just life experiences just taught me that when you really get down to the economic root of things and calling for what can be perceived as someone getting something for nothing. I mean, I've heard debate over or difficulty with people, I follow social media, over these concert venues offering concert tickets if you come and get a vaccine for COVID. You know, that whole getting something for nothing thing, I think, is so pervasive in our society and a huge stumbling block. So I'm very happy to hear what you have, all three of you have had to say today. And I'm hoping that you're correct. I just still have a little twinge that the uphill battle is not soon in our future. So I'm going to listen more, and perhaps you'll convince me that I'm wrong. Michelle, back to you.
Okay, next question. What specific actions of the business sector could be effective on a broad scale?
I can start or Aria, do you want to, or Dr. Roberts, do you want to? I can start, and then you guys can finish it off. So first off, I think the business sector has to companies have to take a targeted approach to the problems they want to solve. So right now, what is going on in corporations is they are being flooded with demands for being active on various issues. And they are just a flutter trying to figure out what the heck to do, and they don't know what they're doing, and they're doing everything. And I think they're doing everything in a very relatively shallow way. So I think the answer is to go deep into their own histories and the histories of their communities and begin to look for opportunities for repair. I'm less interested in them taking kind of broad public stances on issues of voting rights or, for example, electoral college design or any of a variety of things. I think they should be going deep into their history and the history of their communities to understand what they can do. So if you are running a bank in Pittsburgh or in Oklahoma, you know, you're running Commerce Bank in Oklahoma, you should be exploring your history on redlining. You should be exploring your history on what you did and what your predecessor organizations did, and thinking about it, redressing that. I think that's powerful. I think that's more powerful than, you know, checking the box exercises that are all too common today. And that's why I think history is the answer. And I know I'm speaking to the converted, you know, preaching to the converted, but I think history is the answer.
I agree with that. I would just jump in to give an example and to say, I think a big part of that, though, is not only thinking about what companies can do to help, but also thinking about what companies have done and are currently doing that harms, and figuring out how to stop doing those things. I don't think there's enough thought about that within the private sector. I want to call out, the LA Times did a big thing last summer related to, like, they basically did a whole scan into their, like, the history of their like reporting on Black folks and on racism, and they just you know, really evaluated themselves, reckoned with their own past and how they have contributed to biased narratives about Black people in the past, and then made an apology, and then committed to doing things differently in the future, and then committed resources to it. So for us, that was kind of a perfect example of how you go through those 4 pieces of our racial repair cycle. And I think there are so many more companies that can be doing that. In particular, there are, I think, certain sectors that have caused a lot of harm. And I also want to name an organization called Media 2070. I'm going to put a link in the chat. That this is a group of Black media folks and journalists who are doing work around what reparations looks like in the journalism sector. And they've written this essay. It's really amazing. And they're doing a bunch of kind of visioning and organizing around it. And so that's just one example at the sector level of what companies can do.
Well, there's another question that really kind of, I think, continues nicely from this conversation, how do we overcome the movement being launched in many states to block the teaching of curriculum that, quote, makes any given group feel badly about harm that was inflicted by one group on another, end quote? For example, the 1619 Project, that in itself blocks the acknowledgement phase of moving toward reparations.
Yeah, there's no easy answer to this. And I think the answer to this is just like so many of the challenges that we're facing in our political system today. I think, it is so important to be able to study history as fact, not as ideology. And we have to build power in our communities to elect folks who believe that too. And I don't have too much more to say about how we actually overcome that movement.
Thank you. Okay. I have a question. There may be more in the chat, but I really want to Dr. Roberts to cash in on here. I found your history just fascinating. I knew none of that. I've always known that there was some sort of relationship between indigenous people and the Africans, but I had no idea of what was going on. So my simple question, did the association between those two groups remain after 1921? And what is the relationship today?
In one word, fraught. So there is only one of those tribes, the Cherokees, who today actually recognize the descendants of former slaves as citizens. And so they were coerced by the United States to make this decision initially to adopt them as citizens, but afterward, in all of those tribes, except the Chickasaws, they were on tribal councils, they voted, they were on juries, they had essentially full access to every aspect of citizenship. And then that was taken away in the 70s and 80s when the tribal governments essentially began advocating for the removal of those people, creating campaigns that basically said that these people were never Indian, they're not a part of these nations, and thereafter instituting essentially segregation. And so the people who were still able to become citizens did not have full access to all citizenship, like they couldn't vote. Today, still, descendants of the former slaves of Seminoles can't vote. They have a different tribal citizenship card. My family, Chickasaw and Choctaw, freedmen descendants, we can't enroll at all, so we're not considered members of that tribe at all. So yeah, it's still very much second-class citizenship or no citizenship at all. And it's a real story of how anti-Blackness has kind of spread to another group, another non-white group, and how you can very much see how it affects the social and political integration of Black people into a different nation that it runs parallel to the United States and shares many similarities with the United States.
Can I ask Dr. Roberts a question? So I was really taken by your discussion. And I wanted to make sure I understood the history correctly. So, and if there are, like, I'm curious if there are economic studies, because you're almost conjuring a counterfactual world where the promise of 40 acres was fulfilled, but only for some population, right? So has anyone, have economists, because it strikes me like there's a remarkable natural experiment of this population gets the 40 acres, that population doesn't get the 40 acres. And to see, I'm being very, crass, but to see what long run dynamics would be, that seems like a really fascinating kind of study. I'm sure that's at least part of what your work is about, but I'm just curious if economists have started to think about that, because it is one of the great puzzles of American history. If the promise of 40 acres had been fulfilled, what would history have been? Right. There is an economist named Melinda Miller, I think she's at Virginia Tech right now, who did a study of the descendants of slaves of Cherokees,
specifically. And she found, I think she maybe only went up to the early 1900s, early to mid 1900s. And yeah, she found that compared to African Americans in the South, these former slaves had better upward mobility, better education. They were more likely to own property. They were more likely to see generational wealth. All things that we would probably guess would have happened. But yeah, it's a very kind of persuasive study.
Interesting.
Michelle, back to you.
Okay. How can the factors that Dr. Roberts outlined for the success of Black Americans in Oklahoma be better understood as those things that reparations could replicate, such as rights and property?
We've stumped them.
And that was the last question, so have at it.
This is Sam. That was my question because, and this really builds on what Dr. Desai just said and asked about the economic, you know, the natural experiment. If we, and what Linda said, and I echo, I had no idea what might have made the situation for African Americans in Oklahoma more conducive to a Black Wall Street. If it were the case that having rights and property was a critical factor, how could we use that? How could we disseminate that information in a way that encourages people to say, reparations could do that, or that could be part of the goal of reparations, and look what wealth would be generated. And not just, I mean, again, we have to understand that that wealth does not remain just within the African American community, but generates wealth for our whole society.
Well, again, I think.
How do we get more people to study history? I guess I'm asking.
I mean, that economist did write a Washington Post op-ed, like basically saying that, like, look, we have this example of how it works. Like, please examine this as we discuss reparations for the Tulsa Massacre. When I have discussed the land as reparations with students and with other people, sometimes they point to the fact that these are people coming directly out of slavery, whereas today, kind of as Dr. Desai was saying, and or also you, Aria, that there are so many more factors today. Like there are so many more people, there are so many generations removed from what happened, depending on what you're discussing, if it's Jim Crow segregation, redlining that still goes on today, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's kind of the same issue that we've already discussed, where it's like, this is such a clear example, but then when you go into other things, it somehow gets a little more murky to a lot of people.
I think I'll just jump in and add that what it points to, in my perspective, is the fact that we really do need kind of a portfolio of policies that fall under kind of this reparations umbrella. And we would say that some are financial, some are non-financial. An example of a non-financial policy might be around curriculum change, getting to Candace's earlier question. But even within the financial, I think there are real questions about how, what policies actually lead to enabling people to thrive. And in particular, related to the difference between wealth and income. And how we actually do asset transfer, if that's our goal, rather than just cash transfer. And that's, I think, one of the bigger questions that economists are also trying to think through, because some of the current reparations policies actually have shown that they actually wouldn't necessarily close the wealth gap. And so then is that still reparations? And so I think, to me, it just helps me reframe that there has to be kind of a portfolio and a more holistic way of thinking about compensation.
Thank you. And actually, it is 2:29, so I think I am going to take this opportunity to thank all three of our participants, our panelists. You were absolutely wonderful and informative. Your information top-notch, and I thank you so very much for sharing yourselves with us this afternoon. I also warn you that once you become part of the Sankofa Collaborative Network, you are forever a member. So you will be hearing from us. I want to say thank you to our audience for being with us today and for asking your questions. I don't know if there are any left in the chat. I saw some comments that came in afterwards. Please spread the word about this program to your friends, as we did record it, and it will appear on the Sankofa Collaborative website. We also remind you that this came to you free of charge, but we most certainly accept donations and would appreciate anything that you can help us with. Anything that we receive goes directly into programming for the collaborative. Our next scheduled program is not until October 28th, when we will be celebrating our 5th anniversary, and we'll also be launching a brand new initiative, long-term initiative that I think you'll be very excited to hear about, which you'll be getting little reminders of us from now until then. So once again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to members of the collaborative for once again providing information about the past that will serve as an aid to us in the present and give us direction for the future. Thank you.